Okay, this is now the 5-minute tarot for the 4th of September 2017. And today, it's partly a continuation of the Seven of Swords, but it's mainly about how you should treat your observations and your study. When you look at an individual card, let's say, and figure out meanings or wonder about meanings, and maybe you write down your ideas or your thoughts. And I want to say to you, once you've written it down, forget about it. Not erase it from your memory as if you'd never thought of it, but more, you don't need to remember everything you've ever thought about a card when you're doing a reading. And I think that's the point. When you're doing a reading for somebody, you don't need to remember everything, partly because you're not going to say everything anyway. But let me get to that. So it began with Carrie, who left a comment, and I've got this on screen. She said, I was just looking at the Five of Swords and the Eight of Swords. Could you say the same thing about them? Obviously not the exact same thing, but looking at the two swords lying on the ground in the picture of the Five of Swords, could it mean that the choices that have been made concerning the two people walking away or that have walked away, that the choices that have been made, and this goes back to the Two of Swords being a decision to be made, and I made a reference to the two swords stuck upright in the ground with the seven, okay? So could it mean that the choices that have been made about the two people that have walked away are not permanent choices? Because somehow the two swords if a sword is stuck in the ground or obviously fixed in a certain place, then it can mean that the decision or the idea of what the sword represents is in some way permanent, right? But the two swords, they're just lying in the ground, so maybe they're not permanent. The guy with all the swords could make amends, and if he doesn't, there's a good chance that he's going to be heartbroken and will have to carry the Three of the Swords around with him. Does that make any sense? Let me just minimize this window. Okay, so one thing I'd like to point out that in the five, the fellow holding the three swords is not holding three swords, it's two and one. Right, and I think that can be important. The fact that if you were holding three swords in one side, then yes, the three swords go together, and that can make us think of the Three of Swords. But here we've got an ace. We've got the one sword pointing down, and we've got the two swords held off the ground. So somehow it's the ace and the two that the fellow in the foreground is going to be dealing with, which can mean, how is he going to get organized? Or is he even going to get organized in the first place? And it can be important to be organized. But that's a different kind of thing. So is what Carrie said, does it make sense? And the answer is yes, obviously it does. And you're going to find that when you look at a card and think about what it's telling you or what it might mean, you're going to come up with a lot of information that is probably useful. But it won't always be relevant for every question or every answer. And I think that's the point of this video. So by all means, for Carrie and for anybody else, you've looked at the card and you've come up with questions and answers and ideas and thoughts about what the card shows or what's going on in the card. And so, as I said at the beginning, forget it, or you don't need to keep it all in your conscious mind. Because that's a bit like, instead of looking at a book at a range of meanings and trying to pick the right one, you're doing it without a book. You've got a range of meanings inside your own mind, inside your head, and you're sort of thumbing through them or flicking through them, trying to pick the right one. And it doesn't work that well, because your first thought is this the right answer? Or is this the right meaning? Rather than, this is the question, what makes sense from this particular card to give the answer to the question that has been asked. So I think I'd like to say that let's say you've got a range of possible meanings or a range of ideas about what's going on in a particular card. In this case, let's say the Seven of Swords. and you're answering a question. If you happen to remember, let's say Carrie's answering the question, if she happens to remember her idea about a not permanent decision from the two swords lying on the ground, then that's what she should say to the questioner, because it's going to be relevant or important or understandable to the questioner, that the decision that was made isn't permanent. Which can mean that when the questioner later, tomorrow, in the next week, comes back and is going to remember, okay, I was told that this decision I made is not permanent, so I'm not surprised I've got to make it again, or I've got to make maybe a slightly different answer or a different decision based on the the two swords that were lying on the ground. So if or when you remember something that you wrote down a while ago, then speak it and talk about it, because it's going to be relevant or important to the questioner and to the answer. But let's say later you're thinking about the reading and you think, I wish I'd said this, or I wish I'd remembered that. The reason you didn't remember it is because it wasn't relevant, it wasn't important, or maybe the question was going to misunderstand it in some way. So that's why you didn't say it. So you turn the card and you're thinking of the question and you're thinking of the answer, and then you let thoughts come to your mind. And if one of your personal observations comes back to mind, talk about it. If it doesn't, don't struggle to remember it, because that's just that's getting in the way, I think. Because you could turn that same Seven of Swords and you could say to the person, normally when I get this card, I talk about the swords, but I'm noticing this little campfire in the distance and the people are around it. Somehow that seems to me at this moment for this question, that seems to be important, because you've got the people sitting around the campfire and maybe you're a member of that small group. You're focusing on what you're doing and you're not paying attention to things that are happening a distance away. So it can mean that by all means, focus on the task at hand or focus on what the meeting is about. But if you get stray thoughts about somebody or something else, don't ignore it and don't think, well, it doesn't really matter. You wouldn't have thought of it if it hadn't been important. So if you have the idea, maybe I should check up that this person isn't doing something that I wouldn't approve of or I wouldn't give them permission to do, instead of thinking, no, it's okay, I can trust them. You're better to check. So my attention was drawn to the group of people around the campfire. You're around the campfire. So concentrate on what you're doing, but keep maybe a little bit of your thought, or be aware of what's going on at a distance, or what's going on in another room, or what's going on in another part of the building, and make sure that things are happening there the way that you would approve of or the way that you would want. So you might never have noticed that campfire before, but you were reading cards in the moment and we're answering the question that was asked and we're making sense of the card. So if you happen to notice the campfire, you wouldn't have noticed it unless you were supposed to talk about it. So trust and I think this is trusting your intuition. You're not making stuff up and going wild with your connections and your associations and your ideas. You're actually starting with what's in the picture and noticing something that you may not have noticed before, or maybe you did notice it before. So Carrie could turn that card and her attention is drawn to the two swords on the ground, and then she remembers immediately her thoughts about the decision not being permanent. And so she would talk about that naturally, because in some way it relates to the question. But if she doesn't remember that Two of Swords as being a permanent decision or a non-permanent decision, that was the right thing to do, was to not focus on the impermanent decision. Okay, that was it for the moment. Thank you very much. And if you have comments or questions, let me know and we'll take it from there. Okay, thanks. I'll see you probably not tomorrow, but in a couple of days. Okay, bye-bye.